Ava spent the evening reviewing all correspondence, contracts, and legal safeguards, ensuring she had full control over the company's intellectual property. She drafted a series of quiet maneuvers to be enacted if Ethan attempted further unilateral action. She reached out to select allies from the board and early staff, reminding them of the agreements that preserved her influence. Slowly, deliberately, the foundation of her counter-strategy took shape. The betrayal had stripped her of the title, but not of authority. Ethan and Vanessa believed they had won, but Ava had spent months anticipating this moment. Every misstep they had made, every assumption of control, had been recorded and analyzed. The empire they thought they controlled had cracks that only she fully understood, and through those cracks, she would reclaim what was rightfully hers. By the time the city lights shimmered through the penthouse windows, Ava had made a silent vow. Ethan's betrayal would not go unanswered. Crawford Innovations, the empire they had built together, would remember the woman who had laid its foundation. And when the time came, every document, every ally, every strategic safeguard she had preserved would become the instrument of her reckoning. The day after her termination, Ava arrived at Crawford Innovations not as an employee, but as a silent strategist, fully aware of the authority she still wielded. While Ethan and Vanessa strutted through the halls in the illusion of dominance, Ava quietly reviewed the legal clauses and patent rights that preserved her oversight. Every decision they had made in her absence could be challenged, delayed, or redirected, and she knew exactly how to do it without alarming them. Her first move was subtle. She contacted the board under the guise of a procedural inquiry, raising questions about recent contract modifications and software licensing transfers. Each inquiry was meticulously worded, factual, and non-confrontational. Yet beneath the surface, Ava's questions highlighted breaches in protocol and potential violations of the intellectual property agreements. The board, previously deferential to Ethan, now found themselves pausing, reconsidering, and quietly validating Ava's points. Her authority was invisible but undeniable. Meanwhile, Ethan and Vanessa carried on as though nothing had changed. They held meetings, celebrated new deals, and flaunted their supposed control, unaware that Ava had already begun to assert influence behind the scenes. Vanessa's confidence remained high, but Ava noted small cracks in her composure when contracts and clauses she had prepared were referenced. Every subtle reaction confirmed what Ava already suspected: their dominance relied on the assumption that she was powerless, a dangerous oversight. Ava began to expand her quiet network within the company. She reached out to trusted early employees, reminding them of agreements and responsibilities that legally required her oversight. She framed her communications as supportive guidance, never confrontational, ensuring loyalty without sparking fear or rebellion. Slowly, she re-established lines of influence, realigning key personnel to act in accordance with her authority if necessary. By the end of the week, Ava's hidden support network within Crawford Innovations rivaled, and in some cases surpassed, the control Vanessa had assumed. Her strategy extended beyond personnel. Ava carefully monitored financial flows, ensuring she was aware of every contract, licensing deal, and partnership that might bypass her authority. Each move Ethan and Vanessa made to consolidate power inadvertently exposed vulnerabilities, and signed clauses, overlooked approval processes, and misfiled documents. Ava catalogued every detail, understanding that when the moment came, she could leverage these oversights decisively. The personal betrayal remained sharp, but Ava converted it into focus. She no longer questioned why Ethan had fired her, or why he had allowed Vanessa to insert herself so fully into the company. These emotional wounds became fuel, energy directed into strategy rather than despair. Each slight, each marginalization, was logged in her mind as data, predictable behaviors, repeated assumptions, and exploitable weaknesses. One afternoon, a key investor contacted Ava privately, expressing concern over recent changes in leadership and decision-making. Ethan and Vanessa had celebrated new contracts that, while profitable on the surface, exposed the company to long-term risk. Ava, armed with her meticulous documentation and legal safeguards, advised the investor calmly and precisely, outlining how certain decisions might breach contracts or mismanage intellectual property. The investor listened attentively, surprised by her clarity and expertise. This quiet reinforcement of trust began shifting perception. Ava was not just a former employee, she was the linchpin of the company's integrity. Meanwhile, Vanessa noticed Ava's increasing reach, though she misunderstood it as casual persistence rather than calculated authority. She tried subtle intimidation, flaunting her closeness to Ethan, questioning Ava's influence, and attempting to preempt her moves in meetings. But Ava remained unshaken. She responded only with precision, citing clauses, referencing agreements, and guiding decisions without appearing confrontational. Each attempt to undermine her authority was countered by facts and preparation, silent victories accumulating under the radar. The next pivotal moment came when a major software contract, initially altered by Ethan without Ava's knowledge, required formal approval. Ava acted decisively. She sent a measured, factual communication to the board, referencing the clauses that preserved her rights and outlining potential risks if the contract proceeded without proper oversight. The board, now attuned to her authority and impressed by her diligence, paused the contract's execution. Ethan's confidence faltered for the first time. He had assumed that Ava's firing had removed her influence entirely, but he began to notice the subtle resistance, questions from the board, employees quietly consulting her, decisions delayed for procedural clarity. Vanessa, too, sensed the shift, her composure cracking when she realized that Ava's absence was not a loss, but a strategic repositioning. At home, Ava reflected on the progress she had made. The betrayal that had initially stunned her now felt like a catalyst for empowerment. She no longer viewed her firing as the end of control but as a strategic opportunity. Every move she had made, every ally she had strengthened, every legal safeguard she had reinforced, positioned her to reclaim the authority Ethan had assumed was his alone. By the end of the week, Ava had established a quiet yet unassailable presence within Crawford Innovations. She remained terminated in title, but her influence was growing. Ethan and Vanessa, blinded by arrogance and underestimating her resolve, continued to operate under the illusion of unchallenged dominance. They had built a castle on shifting sand, and Ava held the key to its foundation. For the first time since her termination, Ava allowed herself a small, private smile. The storm she had quietly nurtured over months of observation and preparation was now poised to move. The betrayal, once a personal wound, had become the catalyst for strategic reclamation. Crawford Innovations would remember the woman who had built its foundations, and Ethan would soon understand that loyalty, intellect, and foresight are not so easily dismissed, even when wrapped in betrayal. The tension within Crawford Innovations had reached a palpable level, though few recognized it. Ethan, confident in his apparent control, continued to operate with the arrogance of a man who believed he had outmaneuvered every obstacle. Vanessa, ever poised and attentive, mirrored his confidence, assuming her influence was unassailable. Neither of them saw the quiet network Ava had reconstructed, nor the authority she still legally held through patents, contracts, and oversight clauses. Ava's first strategic strike was subtle but effective. She arranged a private review of the latest software deployment with key board members, framing it as a routine procedural check. She highlighted discrepancies she had noticed in the contracts and intellectual property management. Her tone was neutral, professional, precise, yet the implications were clear. If Ethan or Vanessa continued to bypass her authority, the company could face legal and financial consequences. The board, previously deferential to Ethan's charisma, began to question decisions they had accepted without scrutiny. Word spread quietly. Employees, investors, and advisors all started consulting Ava's opinions. Her firing had stripped her of a title, but not of credibility or expertise. The irony was exquisite, the very move intended to diminish her power had instead reinforced it. Ethan's confidence began to show cracks, though he masked them with charm and forced composure. Vanessa, who had relied heavily on Ethan's blind loyalty to secure her position, noticed the subtle shift and tried to intervene, but Ava's preparation was precise, leaving no opening for direct challenge. The pivotal moment arrived during a high-stakes investor call. Ethan and Vanessa presented new projections that, while ambitious, included assumptions that could expose the company to risk. Ava, monitoring remotely, immediately identified errors and procedural oversights that violated agreements she had drafted years ago. Calmly, she sent a formal, factual advisory to the board, referencing clauses that required her review. The board halted the decision, citing potential legal exposure. Ethan's frustration was visible, his composed facade faltering for the first time before the investors. Vanessa's reaction was immediate, a slight tightening of her jaw, a subtle flush of panic that only Ava noticed. Her influence, though public, was contingent on Ethan's unquestioned authority. Ava understood that her timing had turned the perceived strength of their alliance into a vulnerability. Each misstep by Ethan and Vanessa provided leverage for the woman they had tried to erase. Inside the office, Ava orchestrated her next moves quietly. She met with trusted early employees, instructing them to maintain strict adherence to protocols, ensuring that any attempt by Ethan or Vanessa to bypass her authority would trigger compliance checks. Every department, from finance to software development, was subtly aligned to her oversight without revealing her active involvement. She was no longer a sidelined wife, she was the invisible engine maintaining the company's stability. Ethan began to realize, in increments, that the game had changed. Contracts he assumed were his to approve without consultation were now flagged. Decisions made in Vanessa's presence were questioned by staff who previously deferred unquestioningly. Investors began asking for Ava's input, noting her unparalleled expertise and deep knowledge of company operations. Ethan's frustration mounted, though he still tried to maintain his public persona of control. Vanessa, increasingly aware of the fragility of her position, grew anxious, attempting to reinforce her influence with gestures of charm and strategic suggestions, but Ava's network was already firmly in place. Ava's leverage extended beyond internal operations. She began contacting select investors and strategic partners directly, framing communications as advisory, supportive, and professional. Her authority, though unrecognized publicly, became a guiding force in critical decisions. Ethan's attempts to assert dominance were quietly countered by procedural compliance, legal clauses, and the loyalty she had quietly rebuilt. Each step she took was precise, deliberate, and unassailable. The personal aspect of the betrayal remained sharp, yet Ava had transformed it into clarity. She no longer felt the sting of loss in the conventional sense. Instead, each slight, each erasure, each act of betrayal had become data, information she could use, strategy she could deploy. Her heart had hardened into focus, her grief transmuted into calculated patience. The woman who had once been blind to manipulation now commanded the unseen levers of power. By the end of the week, Ethan's confidence was visibly shaken. Meetings that had once been opportunities for him to shine now included checks he had not anticipated. Vanessa's influence, dependent on his support, became unstable. Staff and investors began looking to Ava's guidance in subtle but unmistakable ways. The empire she had helped build was, ironically, stronger because of the betrayal. It had forced her to act with the precision and authority she had quietly cultivated for months. Late one night, Ava reviewed her documents, emails, and internal communications. Every clause she had safeguarded, every ally she had quietly aligned, every procedural safeguard she had preserved now positioned her to reclaim authority fully. The storm she had nurtured during months of observation and preparation was ready to be unleashed, not recklessly, but with precision, timing, and impact. In that quiet moment, Ava understood the profound truth of her journey: betrayal had not destroyed her. It had revealed her power. Crawford Innovations, the company Ethan had sought to control and Vanessa had sought to influence, was now, in essence, under her quiet oversight. The empire they believed they ruled was vulnerable, and she held the keys. As the city lights shimmered through her office window, Ava allowed herself a small, private smile. The battle had begun, and she was no longer a passive participant. The fall of illusions, the unmasking of loyalty, and the quiet assertion of authority were all part of her strategy. Ethan's betrayal had set the stage, Vanessa's overconfidence had provided the opening, and Ava's patience, preparation, and foresight were now ready to claim victory. The following week at Crawford Innovations was charged with an invisible tension. Ethan moved through the office with forced composure, attempting to assert authority he no longer fully controlled. Vanessa followed him closely, smiling confidently, yet subtly on edge. Both were unaware of the quiet network Ava had meticulously reconstructed, the legal safeguards she had preserved, and the employees she had quietly aligned to her oversight. Ava remained outside the office physically, but her influence was pervasive. She sent carefully worded advisories and reminders to key board members, framing them as procedural checks and protective measures. Each note highlighted potential legal and financial consequences if actions were taken without proper review. The board, recognizing her unmatched expertise and authority, began pausing decisions to consult her, even in her absence. Ethan's frustration grew. He had assumed her firing removed any challenge, yet now he faced subtle but consistent resistance. Contracts he expected to sign unilaterally were questioned. Licensing deals he had approved were delayed for procedural compliance. Vanessa attempted to intervene, but her influence relied entirely on Ethan's perception of control. Ava's strategy had turned their assumptions into weaknesses, their arrogance into vulnerabilities. The turning point arrived during a critical investor meeting. Ethan and Vanessa presented projections for a new software expansion that, while ambitious, contained hidden risks Ava had identified. She sent a factual advisory to the board, referencing clauses that required her approval for any deviation from standard intellectual property use and licensing agreements. The board, respecting her legal authority, delayed the project until her oversight could be confirmed. The effect was immediate. Ethan's confident facade faltered. Vanessa's composure cracked as she realized the leverage Ava still wielded. Employees began discreetly aligning with Ava's guidance, while investors quietly acknowledged her authority. The empire that had seemed entirely in Ethan and Vanessa's hands was now subtly, quietly shifting beneath their feet. Ava's next move was even more strategic. She coordinated with legal counsel to ensure that any attempt by Ethan or Vanessa to bypass her authority would trigger automatic compliance checks. Internal departments were subtly instructed to follow protocols she had long established, creating a web of accountability that reinforced her control. Every potential move by Ethan or Vanessa became constrained by the very safeguards they had overlooked in their overconfidence. At home, Ava allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The personal betrayal still stung, but she had transformed it into clarity and focus. Every slight, every act of marginalization, every erasure of her contributions, had been catalogued and converted into strategic advantage. She no longer felt powerless, she felt prepared, precise, and patient. The woman Ethan had attempted to sideline was now orchestrating the company's operations with invisible authority. By midweek, subtle signs of disruption began appearing. Ethan attempted to override a minor licensing agreement, only to find staff and board members referencing clauses Ava had preserved. Vanessa, noticing the hesitation and questioning from employees, tried to assert her influence, but every move was anticipated and countered by the procedures Ava had set in place. Confidence eroded, replaced by the first inklings of panic. Ava seized another opportunity by reaching out to a group of strategic partners, presenting insights that aligned with the company's interests while highlighting risks that had been overlooked. The partners, impressed by her precision and foresight, began to consult her directly, bypassing Ethan and Vanessa entirely. Their perception of authority shifted quietly but decisively, reinforcing Ava's growing invisible dominance. By the end of the week, the cumulative effect was undeniable. Ethan and Vanessa, blinded by arrogance, had failed to recognize the depth of Ava's preparation. The empire they believed they controlled had fissures only she could navigate, and she had done so with meticulous care. Every move she had made, every ally she had strengthened, every clause she had safeguarded, positioned her to reclaim authority fully. Late one night, Ava reviewed her plans, contracts, and communications. She realized that the stage was set for a decisive reclamation. Her patience had created leverage that Ethan and Vanessa could not anticipate. The betrayal that had initially shattered her world had become the instrument of her resurgence. Crawford Innovations, the company she had built alongside Ethan, would not forget her role, and the illusion of unchallenged dominance held by Ethan and Vanessa was now dangerously fragile. Ava allowed herself a quiet smile. The fall of illusions, the unmasking of loyalty, and the assertion of authority were all part of her strategy. She had transformed betrayal into power, marginalization into preparation, and humiliation into opportunity. Ethan and Vanessa had underestimated her, and now they would see the consequences of that miscalculation. The morning after the board meeting that highlighted Ava's invisible authority, the atmosphere at Crawford Innovations was tense. Ethan arrived with his usual bravado, but cracks in his confidence were now evident. Vanessa, though composed on the surface, fidgeted subtly, sensing that the foundation of their assumed control was slipping. Ava, though physically absent from the office, exerted an invisible influence that grew stronger by the hour. Ava's first move in her reclamation strategy was deliberate and understated. She scheduled a series of private calls with board members, framing them as advisory sessions for procedural alignment and risk mitigation. Each conversation subtly reminded them of her legal authority, the clauses she had safeguarded, and the potential consequences of bypassing her oversight. The board, previously deferential to Ethan's charm, began acknowledging Ava's pivotal role with renewed respect. Meanwhile, employees started consulting her more openly, even in her absence. They approached her for clarification on processes, approvals, and decisions, understanding that Ava's expertise and authority were not diminished by her firing. Vanessa's influence, reliant on Ethan's unchallenged support, began to falter. Subtle hesitations in meetings, unanswered questions, and cautious compliance from staff revealed that Ava's network of loyalty had quietly grown stronger than ever. Ava's strategy extended beyond oversight. She began identifying areas where Ethan and Vanessa had made operational errors, from minor contract missteps to decisions that could compromise long-term growth. She communicated these findings to key stakeholders with precision, never accusing, never emotional, simply presenting facts, clauses, and potential risks. Each revelation reinforced her authority, positioning her as the indispensable architect of the company's stability. Ethan, increasingly frustrated, attempted to regain control through public displays of confidence. He called impromptu meetings, made hasty decisions, and relied on Vanessa to assert influence over staff. Yet each move was anticipated by Ava's quiet network. Departments acted in accordance with her preserved procedures, approvals were delayed for compliance checks she had quietly ensured, investors began seeking her counsel before signing off on key decisions. The illusion of unchallenged control was crumbling. The personal betrayal that had once felt like a wound was now a tool. Ava no longer reacted with anger or despair, she acted with clarity and purpose. Every slight, every erasure, every moment of betrayal had been catalogued and transformed into strategy. She had converted pain into patience, grief into foresight, and exclusion into leverage. A decisive opportunity emerged when Ethan attempted to fast-track a new software partnership without Ava's knowledge. The agreement included clauses that directly infringed on patents she co-owned and required her consent. Ava immediately invoked the clauses, sending a formal, precise communication to the board and legal counsel. The board halted the partnership pending her review. Investors, once loyal to Ethan's charm, now deferred to Ava's expertise. Vanessa's confidence wavered, her influence diminishing with each procedural compliance check. At home, Ava reflected on the progress she had made. Months of preparation, observation, and strategic planning had culminated in a moment of quiet power. She had not confronted Ethan directly with anger, nor had she publicly challenged Vanessa. Instead, she had built a structure of authority so solid that any attempt to bypass it would falter. Crawford Innovations, the company she had helped build from the ground up, was now subtly, quietly, undeniably under her influence once more. Her next move was to solidify control. Ava began reviewing every department's operations, ensuring that all key processes adhered to the clauses she had preserved. She reached out to early employees and trusted advisors, confirming loyalty and clarifying responsibilities. By the end of the week, she had established a network capable of enforcing her authority without direct confrontation. Ethan's reliance on appearances, Vanessa's dependence on him, and the staff's cautious compliance all played into her strategy. Late one evening, Ava drafted a communication to the board, summarizing her review, highlighting risks, and presenting recommendations. The tone was neutral, professional, and authoritative, leaving no room for dispute. The board, impressed by her thoroughness and insight, endorsed her recommendations, further reinforcing her invisible yet undeniable control. Ava understood that rising from the ashes required patience as much as action. The betrayal, the firing, and the attempts to marginalize her had all been catalysts, forcing her to act with precision rather than impulse. She had learned that power was not always about visibility, it was about leverage, preparation, and timing. By the end of the week, the office atmosphere had shifted. Ethan and Vanessa still occupied their positions physically, but their influence was no longer absolute. Subtle hesitations, deferred decisions, and quiet compliance revealed that Ava's unseen hand now guided the company. Her network, her expertise, and her preserved authority had transformed the landscape. She had risen from the betrayal stronger, wiser, and more strategically powerful than ever before. In that quiet moment, Ava realized the full extent of her transformation. The woman who had been fired, erased, and betrayed was now the cornerstone of Crawford Innovations' stability and growth. Her patience, strategy, and foresight had converted personal loss into professional dominance. The stage was set for the final moves, where the empire she had built would fully acknowledge her authority, and the consequences of betrayal would be fully realized. Ava's influence, though quiet at first, began to ripple visibly through Crawford Innovations. Staff who had once deferred to Vanessa now sought guidance from Ava, even in her absence. Investor meetings that had previously been Ethan's stage were increasingly directed toward her input, her recommendations shaping decisions without the board ever publicly acknowledging her authority. Each subtle action reinforced her presence, dismantling the illusion of Ethan and Vanessa's unchallenged control. The first overt sign of Ava's resurgence came during a meeting regarding a major software contract. Ethan had assumed he could finalize the deal without her input. Ava, having anticipated this, had already prepared documentation highlighting critical clauses that required her approval. She submitted her review directly to the board and legal counsel, emphasizing procedural compliance and risk mitigation. The board paused the contract, and Ethan's confident posture faltered. Vanessa's frustration was palpable. She attempted to assert influence by steering discussions, framing suggestions as her own insight. But Ava's network of loyal employees subtly countered her efforts, raising procedural questions, referencing prior agreements, and seeking Ava's guidance. Each subtle pushback reinforced Ava's authority while exposing Vanessa's over-reliance on Ethan's support. Ava decided it was time to make her influence fully visible. She organized a series of strategic briefings with the board, presenting her insights on long-term growth, intellectual property protection, and investor relations. Her tone was measured, professional, and authoritative. Each recommendation highlighted the risks of unilateral decision-making by Ethan and Vanessa, without directly attacking them. The board, impressed by her clarity and foresight, began formally integrating her guidance into corporate strategy. Ethan noticed, but he underestimated the depth of her control. He attempted to assert authority by approving minor operational changes without consulting her, assuming the board would follow his lead. To his surprise, the board requested Ava's review before proceeding. Vanessa tried to mediate, suggesting adjustments to preserve appearances, but Ava's meticulous preparations left little room for manipulation. For the first time, Ethan realized that firing Ava had not removed her power, it had merely delayed its public assertion. Ava's next move was to solidify loyalty among key departments. She reached out to early employees, framing communications as mentorship and guidance rather than directives. She emphasized the importance of adhering to procedural safeguards and consulting her on decisions impacting intellectual property or major partnerships. By the end of the week, these departments operated as extensions of her oversight, ensuring that any attempt by Ethan or Vanessa to bypass her authority would encounter coordinated resistance. With her foundation secured, Ava began addressing external perceptions. She arranged confidential briefings with investors and strategic partners, presenting insights that demonstrated her unparalleled knowledge of the company and its operations. The investors, many of whom had previously admired Ethan's charisma, began placing their trust in Ava's expertise. They saw her as indispensable, a stabilizing force that ensured the company's long-term success. Vanessa's anxiety increased as she noticed the shift. Staff deferred to Ava in subtle ways, investors sought her counsel directly, and Ethan's authority appeared increasingly undermined. Each attempt to assert influence without her involvement backfired, exposing cracks in their control. Ava, meanwhile, remained poised and composed, allowing their overconfidence to continue fueling the momentum she had built. The personal element of betrayal, once a source of emotional turmoil, had become a tool of clarity. Ava no longer acted out of anger, she acted with precision. Every slight, every act of marginalization, every erasure of her contributions had been catalogued and transformed into strategy. She was no longer the sidelined wife or the former employee, she was the architect of the company's stability and growth. By midweek, Ava's authority was undeniable. Key contracts required her review, investor relations relied on her insight, and departments operated in accordance with her guidance. Ethan's confidence faltered, his attempts at dominance increasingly ineffective. Vanessa, realizing the fragility of her position, became cautious, hesitant to make decisions without consulting Ava. The balance of power had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. Late one evening, Ava reviewed the week's progress from her home office. She had transformed betrayal into leverage, marginalization into preparation, and exclusion into visible authority. Crawford Innovations, the empire Ethan had assumed he controlled, now recognized her as the cornerstone of its stability. The stage was set for the next phase, fully reclaiming her role, exposing Ethan's betrayal, and reshaping the company in her vision. She allowed herself a quiet smile. The woman who had been fired and betrayed was no longer sidelined, she was ascending. Every move had been calculated, every ally carefully aligned, every procedural safeguard preserved. Ethan and Vanessa had underestimated her, and now the consequences of their arrogance would soon be undeniable. The moment Ava had long prepared for arrived with deliberate precision. It began with a high-profile board meeting called to discuss a multi-million-dollar software partnership. Ethan assumed he would present the deal as a demonstration of his unchallenged authority. Vanessa, poised and smiling, anticipated a smooth victory over the company she believed she now influenced. Neither of them realized the trap Ava had set. Ava entered the boardroom virtually, appearing on the screen with calm authority. Her presence alone shifted the atmosphere, staff straightened, investors leaned forward, and even Ethan's confident posture faltered subtly. She greeted the board, outlined the agenda, and immediately highlighted critical clauses in the proposed contract that had been overlooked. The language was precise, factual, and unassailable, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Ethan attempted to interject, his voice carrying that practiced charm meant to command attention. But Ava's responses were swift, measured, and backed by documentation. Every point he raised was countered with references to patents, contracts, and procedures she had preserved. Vanessa tried to support him with subtle suggestions, but Ava anticipated each one, neutralizing their influence without appearing confrontational. The board listened intently, realizing that Ava's expertise and authority were not only intact but indispensable. Investors, previously swayed by Ethan's charisma, now acknowledged her as the guiding force behind Crawford Innovations' stability and growth. The shift was unmistakable, authority had returned to the woman they had tried to erase. Ava then moved to expose the broader implications of Ethan and Vanessa's decisions. She outlined risks associated with unauthorized licensing agreements, intellectual property transfers, and procedural oversights. Each point was backed with precise documentation, contracts she had drafted, and a history of decisions that proved her foresight. The room, once aligned with Ethan's charm, now absorbed Ava's authority as a legal and operational necessity. Ethan's frustration grew, visible in his tense jaw and the subtle clenching of his fists. He realized, too late, that firing Ava had not eliminated her influence, it had only delayed its public assertion. Vanessa's composure cracked further, her attempts to assert control rendered ineffective by the procedures and alliances Ava had meticulously preserved. The illusion of their dominance was crumbling before their eyes. Ava's strategy extended beyond the boardroom. She coordinated with key departments to ensure compliance with the procedures she had set, effectively giving her operational oversight without requiring direct confrontation. Employees, once uncertain about loyalty, now acted in accordance with her guidance, reinforcing her authority while maintaining professional discretion. Each department became an extension of her influence, subtly constraining Ethan and Vanessa's actions. Next, Ava addressed external perceptions. She conducted private briefings with investors and partners, demonstrating her command over the company's operations, risk management, and intellectual property. Each communication reinforced the reality: Crawford Innovations' stability depended on her expertise. Investors, previously loyal to Ethan's persona, began consulting her first, acknowledging her as the essential architect of the company's success. With each day, Ava's control became more visible. Decisions previously made unilaterally by Ethan were now deferred for procedural review. Vanessa's influence weakened as staff and board members increasingly relied on Ava's guidance. Even minor missteps by Ethan were flagged and corrected, highlighting the extent of Ava's preserved authority. Her network, built quietly and carefully, operated seamlessly, asserting her power without open conflict. By the end of the week, the company's dynamics had shifted irrevocably. Ava, though still officially fired, had reclaimed practical control over Crawford Innovations. Ethan and Vanessa, blindsided by the precision of her strategy, were forced to operate within the framework she had established. Every move they made, every decision they attempted, was now subject to her influence. The empire they had assumed belonged to them was quietly, decisively under her command. Late that evening, Ava reviewed the week's outcomes. Each contract delayed, each procedural safeguard reinforced, each department aligned with her guidance was a testament to her strategic patience. The betrayal that had once felt like devastation had become the catalyst for her ascension. Crawford Innovations, the company she had built with her own hands, was no longer threatened by Ethan's arrogance or Vanessa's overconfidence. For the first time since her firing, Ava allowed herself to feel the full weight of triumph, not in a public display, but in the undeniable restoration of authority. She had transformed exclusion into opportunity, marginalization into leverage, and betrayal into power. The empire had been shaken, but it now recognized her as its indispensable cornerstone. Ava's final reflection that night was quiet, yet resolute. She had risen from the ashes, reclaimed her influence, and exposed the cracks in Ethan and Vanessa's presumed dominance. The stage was set for the final act, the full reckoning, the restoration of justice, and the ultimate reshaping of the company in her vision. The morning sun streamed into Ava's home office as she reviewed the final pieces of her strategy. Crawford Innovations, the empire she had co-built, was now under her practical control, and every safeguard, every procedural alignment, and every loyal ally she had nurtured was ready to enforce her authority. Today would mark the beginning of the reckoning, the moment when betrayal met its consequence. Ethan arrived at the office with a forced composure, unaware of the full extent of Ava's resurgence. Vanessa followed closely, smiling as though everything were normal, yet the tension in her posture betrayed unease. Staff greeted them politely, yet the subtle deference had shifted. Eyes that once awaited their directives now looked toward Ava's influence, her procedures, and her preserved authority. The board convened for a critical meeting regarding the company's expansion strategy. Ethan assumed he would guide the discussion, projecting confidence and charm. Vanessa, poised and strategic, prepared to assert influence as he leaned on her support. But Ava, fully aware of their assumptions, entered virtually with calm authority, her presence alone commanding attention. She opened the meeting with a precise, factual overview of the company's current status, highlighting operational strengths and potential risks. Without raising her voice or showing emotion, she referenced clauses, contracts, and patents that required her oversight, demonstrating that any unilateral decisions by Ethan or Vanessa could be legally and operationally challenged. The board listened intently, investors leaned forward, and the subtle power shift was undeniable. Ethan attempted to interject, his voice carrying practiced charisma meant to command attention. Ava anticipated every argument, countering each point with documented evidence and procedural references. Vanessa tried to support him, offering suggestions and framing ideas as her own insight, but Ava's thorough preparation neutralized every move. The duo's confidence faltered as they realized their control was no longer absolute. Ava then executed a decisive move. She formally proposed a revised expansion plan, highlighting risk mitigation, potential partnerships, and intellectual property safeguards. Her recommendations were strategic, clear, and backed by documentation only she could provide. The board, convinced of her authority, unanimously endorsed her plan. Investors, too, acknowledged the clarity and foresight she provided, reinforcing her position as the indispensable leader of Crawford Innovations. Ethan's frustration became visible, his jaw tight, hands clenching. Vanessa's anxiety intensified as she noted the subtle but consistent deference to Ava's authority from staff, board members, and investors alike. Every attempt they made to assert dominance was constrained by the legal and procedural safeguards Ava had preserved and the network of loyalty she had rebuilt. The illusion of their unchallenged control was collapsing before them. Ava allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction, but her approach remained strategic, never impulsive. She began addressing broader operational issues, contracts bypassed, licensing agreements mismanaged, and staff decisions made without adherence to procedural safeguards. Each correction was delivered with precision, ensuring compliance while highlighting the necessity of her oversight. Ethan and Vanessa could do nothing without exposing themselves to operational and legal challenges she had meticulously preserved. The staff, once uncertain of loyalty, now operated confidently under Ava's guidance. Departments aligned with her oversight, ensuring that any attempt by Ethan or Vanessa to circumvent her authority would encounter coordinated resistance. Investors, witnessing Ava's command and expertise, increasingly deferred to her judgment. The empire, though once shaken by betrayal, now recognized her as its true pillar. By midweek, the consequences of Ethan and Vanessa's arrogance became undeniable. Major decisions could no longer proceed without Ava's review. Contracts stalled without her approval, operational directives were filtered through the network she had rebuilt. Ethan's attempts to assert authority were stymied at every turn, and Vanessa's influence weakened with each department that deferred to Ava's guidance. The power balance had shifted completely. Late one evening, Ava reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Betrayal, firing, and marginalization had once threatened to break her. Instead, they had catalyzed a transformation. She had converted exclusion into leverage, anger into strategy, and humiliation into authority. Crawford Innovations, the empire Ethan had believed he controlled, now recognized her as its cornerstone. Ava allowed herself a private, victorious smile. The stage was set for the final moves: visible, undeniable reclamation of her position, exposure of betrayal, and permanent assertion of her authority. She had risen from the ashes, strategically, patiently, and decisively. Ethan and Vanessa's era of assumed dominance was over. The following morning, Ava arrived at Crawford Innovations in person for the first time since her firing. The office fell into an unusual quiet. Staff who had once looked to Ethan now greeted her with respectful nods and cautious smiles. Investors in attendance for a scheduled meeting paused, recognizing the presence of the woman who had quietly reclaimed authority while remaining terminated. Ethan was already in the boardroom, attempting to maintain his composure. Vanessa followed, her smile tight, a mask over growing unease. They both assumed her presence would be a formality, a courtesy visit, nothing more. They had underestimated the transformation that months of preparation, strategy, and silent maneuvering had created. Ava entered the room calmly, her posture confident, her expression composed. She greeted everyone professionally, acknowledging the board, staff, and investors. Then, without hesitation, she addressed Ethan directly. "Ethan," she began, her tone even, "we need to discuss the recent contract modifications, licensing agreements, and procedural bypasses. Several actions have violated clauses that require my oversight." His expression froze momentarily, the realization dawning that her influence was no longer invisible. Vanessa shifted uneasily, sensing that Ava was no longer simply a consultant or former employee, she was the authority controlling the company's operations. Ava continued, methodical and precise. These actions, though perhaps unintentional, expose Crawford Innovations to legal and operational risk. I am reinstating oversight authority for all departments and contracts effective immediately. Any deviation will require documented justification and board acknowledgement. The room fell silent. Board members exchanged glances, subtly nodding to Ava. Staff straightened, acknowledging her restored authority without hesitation. Ethan's jaw tightened, the first cracks in his public composure fully visible. Vanessa's smile faltered, replaced by an anxious awareness of the authority Ava now wielded. Ava then addressed the broader implications. Beyond oversight, there will be a review of all recent decisions, partnerships, and contracts. Transparency and compliance are non-negotiable. My role is to ensure the company we built is protected, and I will exercise that authority fully. Ethan attempted to speak, to reassert dominance with his usual charm. But Ava, anticipating this, held a calm, unyielding gaze. Your input is noted, Ethan, as it always has been, she said evenly. However, moving forward, adherence to corporate governance and procedural safeguards is mandatory. Vanessa tried to interject on Ethan's behalf, offering justifications for her influence over staff and decisions. Ava addressed her with measured clarity. Vanessa, I respect your contributions, but influence without alignment to procedures and oversight creates risk. All departments will follow established processes, which include my review and approval for critical actions. The board, investors, and staff all acknowledged her authority without hesitation. The shift was complete. Ava was no longer a sidelined employee, she was the CEO in practice, the central authority whose guidance was now absolute. Ethan and Vanessa, blindsided by her meticulous strategy and the loyalty she had quietly rebuilt, could only watch as the reality of their miscalculation became undeniable. Ava then executed the final phase of her plan. She presented a comprehensive review of recent company actions, highlighting areas of risk and recommending corrective measures. Every point was backed by documentation she had preserved, contracts she had drafted, and oversight procedures she had maintained. The board unanimously approved her recommendations, cementing her authority and formally reinstating her role in all operational and strategic matters. Ethan's frustration was now palpable. The public charisma he had relied on for authority could not override the legal, procedural, and operational reality Ava controlled. Vanessa's influence collapsed alongside his, her confidence replaced by the awareness that she had relied entirely on assumptions rather than substance. Ava concluded the meeting with quiet authority. The company we built is now stabilized. Moving forward, all decisions will reflect transparency, accountability, and adherence to the procedures and protections I have safeguarded. Crawford Innovations will thrive because its foundation is respected and reinforced. As the meeting adjourned, staff and board members discreetly acknowledged Ava's leadership. Ethan and Vanessa were left to absorb the full weight of their miscalculations. Ava had reclaimed her empire not with anger, confrontation, or spectacle, but with strategy, patience, and meticulous preparation. The betrayal that had once seemed devastating had become the catalyst for her ultimate triumph. Later that evening, Ava reflected on the journey. She had risen from betrayal, marginalization, and exclusion to full authority. Crawford Innovations, the empire she had built and nurtured, now recognized her as its cornerstone. The woman who had been fired, undermined, and underestimated had emerged victorious, stronger, wiser, and unassailable. Ava allowed herself a private smile. The reckoning was complete, the empire restored under her vision, and the consequences of betrayal fully realized. The city lights shimmered through her office window, reflecting the transformation of both her personal and professional life. She had not only reclaimed her position but had reshaped the company and its future, proving that true authority is earned through strategy, foresight, and unwavering resolve. The days following Ava's full reclamation of authority at Crawford Innovations were marked by quiet but unmistakable change. The company, once teetering under Ethan and Vanessa's mismanagement, stabilized under her oversight. Departments operated efficiently, investors sought her guidance first, and the board fully recognized her authority. Ava's strategy had transformed what had once been betrayal and marginalization into the ultimate demonstration of her leadership. Ethan, still occupying the office physically, struggled to regain relevance. Every move he attempted to assert control was countered by procedures, contracts, and employees aligned with Ava's guidance. He had assumed that charisma and position could override substance, but Ava had built a foundation of authority that could not be ignored. Each failed attempt to bypass her oversight reinforced his diminished influence. Vanessa, once confident and poised, now moved through the office with uncertainty. Her assumed dominance depended entirely on Ethan's cooperation, and with his authority undermined, her own position faltered. Staff no longer deferred to her. Decisions she made without Ava's review were challenged, corrected, or deferred. The illusion of her power had collapsed. Ava's approach was not fueled by vengeance but by clarity and purpose. She held meetings with Ethan and Vanessa, not to humiliate, but to assert operational expectations, define roles, and ensure accountability. Every instruction was precise, professional, and legally grounded. Her presence reminded them that authority was not a gift of charm or manipulation, it was earned, preserved, and enforced through expertise, preparation, and adherence to principles. During one pivotal board session, Ava presented a comprehensive strategy for the company's expansion, intellectual property protection, and investor relations. The plan, detailed and meticulous, left no room for unilateral action by Ethan or Vanessa. The board, impressed by her clarity, unanimously endorsed her recommendations. Investors, seeing the company's renewed stability under her leadership, renewed support and trust. Ethan's frustration reached its peak during this session. He attempted to interject, to assert his perspective, but Ava calmly addressed every point, referencing contracts, clauses, and prior agreements. Each response highlighted his miscalculations and the consequences of ignoring her authority. Vanessa, sensing the futility of resistance, remained silent, her influence entirely dependent on the very man whose authority had been eroded. Ava's network of loyal employees ensured that all operational areas adhered to her guidance. Departments functioned efficiently, risks were mitigated, and the company's growth trajectory stabilized. Every procedural safeguard she had preserved now operated seamlessly, reinforcing her dominance. Her victory was not loud or public, it was structural, operational, and unassailable. In the following weeks, Ava began implementing her vision for Crawford Innovations. She introduced new policies for transparency, accountability, and innovation, ensuring that the company would not be vulnerable to mismanagement or personal agendas again. Employees responded positively, inspired by her expertise and leadership. Investors grew confident, seeing that the company's future rested in capable hands. Ethan and Vanessa, witnessing Ava's success, could only watch. Their attempts to undermine her had backfired, leaving them sidelined in a company they once assumed they controlled. Ethan, once confident in his charm and strategic positioning, realized too late that his betrayal had underestimated the very foundation Ava had built. Vanessa, having relied on perception over substance, faced the consequences of overconfidence and misjudgment. Ava's final assertion of authority came during a high-level meeting where all critical decisions were reviewed. She clarified her role, confirmed departmental compliance, and outlined strategic goals. Every participant acknowledged her authority, formally or subtly, signaling the permanent shift in power. Crawford Innovations, once threatened by betrayal and internal conflict, now operated under the steady, strategic hand of the woman who had built it. At the close of the day, Ava reflected quietly in her office. She had transformed personal pain into professional triumph, betrayal into strategic advantage, and exclusion into restored authority. Crawford Innovations was no longer threatened by mismanagement, arrogance, or misplaced loyalty. The company she had nurtured, protected, and rebuilt now thrived under her guidance. Ethan and Vanessa's era of assumed dominance was over. Ava had reclaimed what was hers, not through anger or confrontation, but through strategy, foresight, and unwavering patience. The empire they had tried to control was now firmly and permanently under her vision. Ava allowed herself a private smile, one born of triumph, clarity, and justice. She had risen from betrayal, reclaimed her authority, and reshaped Crawford Innovations into a company that reflected her leadership, intelligence, and resilience. The reckoning was complete, and the legacy of her perseverance would define the future. As the city lights shimmered outside her office window, Ava understood the profound truth of her journey: true power is not taken, it is earned, preserved, and wielded with precision. Betrayal had been the catalyst, patience the weapon, and foresight the strategy. She had not only reclaimed her empire but had transformed it, ensuring that the woman who was once underestimated would never again be overlooked. If you enjoyed this video, kindly give us a thumbs up, subscribe, share, and don't forget to tell us where you are watching from. Timeless Stories love you.